One of the best things I've ever done for myself to improve my life, to make my days feel more magical, more easy, more light, is spending a chunk of time doing the boring work of building my emotional regulation skills. I truly believe that if you dedicate some time to intentionally improving your ability to emotionally regulate, it's one of those skills that will subtly and not so subtly improve every aspect of your life and improve every day of your life. And I'm saying that with my chest because I've seen it do that for me. So in this podcast episode, I want to talk about exactly how to do that. Welcome to Grow With Intention, the podcast for people who want to create a life that feels good. In this podcast episode, I am talking about 3 of my go-to emotional regulation skills that I think anyone with a lot of feelings should be getting out of their toolkit regularly. I have done a deep dive episode on emotional regulation before, and that's going to be linked in the show notes. But this episode is a little bit more focused on giving you like the day-to-day tools that you can use. And before I start talking about those tools, I want to talk about what emotional regulation is because there is so much information out there that it's confusing at this point. So people who have good emotional regulation skills have healthy relationships with their emotions, including the difficult ones, even the sadness, the jealousy, the anger. And they know the best ways to react when those emotions appear. Because they have good relationships with their emotions, they react to them in healthy ways. Those emotions evolve and shift more naturally than they might with other people who don't have such good relationships with their emotions. To make this a little bit more tangible, imagine a world in which when you stepped into a room, everyone reacted to you with anger, fear, frustration, despair, confusion, annoyance. Would you thrive? Would you be able to evolve and shift? Would you be able to grow into the best version of yourself? No, you would shame spiral and you would stay stagnant. And your feelings are much the same. If every time sadness, anger, guilt, jealousy appears, you overreact to that feeling with frustration, anxiety, etc., that feeling will always be something that stays stagnant and struggles to shift, evolve, and grow. So in this podcast episode, I want to give you 3 new ways of reacting to your emotions. These are things that I have started using all the time in the past few years. And when you start using them, you'll notice that your relationships with your emotions will change for the better. I'm also going to talk about how I personally use these strategies so that you'll be like, okay, that's how I could use them in my life too. As I talk through these mental moves, something that I would suggest trying is thinking back to a time when you had a big emotion and just practicing using these mental moves as I talk through them, seeing how they feel. Starting with mental move number 1. So Steve Magnus, a top sports coach, worked with a runner named Meredith. Before every race, Meredith had this problem. She started throwing up out of nervousness and fear. And she was in this cycle of trying to do everything that she could to stop herself from throwing up because that's not a nice pre-running ritual. So naturally, every time the urge to throw up would appear prior to a race, she would respond to that urge and that anxiety with despair, with frustration, with how can I make this go away? So one day, pre-race, Meredith walks up to Steve and she's like, hey, I feel like I'm going to throw up. And he decided he was going to flip the script. He responded and he was like, great. When? And in response, she was like, I don't want to do it. I don't want to throw up. And to that, he said, yeah, I know, but it's going to happen. So let's plan it in. What time do you want to throw up? Should we do it pre-jog, after the drills, within your warm-up routine? Let's just pop it in there. So she decided with Steve, I'm going to schedule my throwing up for 9:45 just before my strides. And when the time came, inevitably, she didn't feel the urge to be sick. She also had the best race of her career. And all that Steve did was change his reaction to her anxiety about being sick. He threw out the welcome mat. Instead of the usual process that they would go through, which was like, oh God, this experience is awful, horrible, we've got to get rid of it. Steve welcomed it. And in doing that, he helped Meredith to change her relationship with it. She no longer saw it as a threat. And so she allowed it to evolve and dissipate on its own. So this is an emotional regulation strategy that I mostly use for worry. I'm not actually too much of a worrier, but some days I will just get times when I'm like, this is going to go wrong, or what about this thing in your distant future? And when that happens, I try to emulate Steve. I'm like, welcome. So glad you're here, looking out for me. Love that you care so much about me and my future. Let's slot you in. 3:30, does that work for you? And I schedule a little worry hour on my calendar when I can sit down and really reflect on my worries. But most of the time when that hour comes, those worries are gone. They disappeared on their own. When you change your reaction to your feelings will naturally change. And that was just one example of changing your reaction. The next way is slightly different, and I find it more helpful for bigger emotions. So one of the things that I really got wrong when I started entering the emotional regulation space is I took the saying of feel your feelings so literally. I was like, okay, I need to feel my feelings. I need to dive into them. I need to let them take over. That's the healthy response to emotions. But actually that can make you much more dysregulated. Because if someone had bad road rage, to help them fix their road rage, you wouldn't say, you know what you need to do? Throw yourself into the road rage. Let road rage take over. It's completely misunderstanding what emotional regulation is. And that's not to say that emotional regulation should be suppression and let's get rid of that feeling. It's somewhere in the middle. The key belief that you really need to hold if you want to be more emotionally regulated is you are not your feelings. You are not your thoughts. They are just experiences that you have. They are not you. And this next mental move is one of my favorite ways to really embrace that idea. This is one I've talked about a bit, and I particularly like to use with rejection sensitivity. Rejection is a feeling that I struggle with and that I'm working on. And I find that this technique is just like the perfect fit for it. So if I notice that feeling of rejection sensitivity, I will sit down, usually close my eyes, and I will start to note where that feeling is in my body or my brain. So I'm quite literally picturing it as if it's a real tangible visual thing. I'm seeing it as if it has a shape, it has a color, it has a texture to it. I also often pair this with an image. So I'll sort of ask myself, if this was a literal object, what would it look like? So sometimes that might be like a knot. You might get an image of a bubble appear in your brain. Once again, this is about changing your reaction to your feeling. And so often when we have difficult feelings, it's actually not the difficult feeling that is the problem. It's the reaction to the difficult feeling. It's the feelings about the feeling. That's what we need to work on more, which is why I like this strategy, because instead of having a big emotional reaction to your feeling, instead you're like sitting there going, let's watch the show. What does this look like? If it was an image, what would it be? Etc., etc. And usually this leads to the feeling resolving itself. Mind you, one of the key things with emotional regulation is you should never be using emotional regulation skills as a strategy to disappear your feelings and get rid of them. That will almost always backfire, and it takes a bit of practice to get to a stage where you're not doing that. Mental move number 3, the wine walk. So a lot of emotional regulation strategies that you see online, I find them so serious. And I don't even mean this in a mocking way. A lot of them are usually, it'll be like place your hand on your heart and like really get in touch with your inner child and et cetera, et cetera. And I really respect that. However, sometimes I'm just more of a playful gal. So like sometimes doing that might feel almost like an overreaction in itself, like I'm taking the feeling so seriously. However, one of my new favorite emotional regulation tools when I'm feeling just really whiny is I will take myself on a little wine walk. I will talk to the trees, to universe, to God, either in my head or out loud, and I will really exaggeratedly put out my complaints into the world. So to give you an example of this, a while ago now, I went on a little solo trip up the mountains. I stayed at this beautiful Airbnb. There were flower gardens around me. I was so lucky to be staying there. However, that first day, I got all these feelings of I should be feeling happier. Like, why am I feeling so anxious? I just got into this little cycle of negativity. And so I took myself on a little wine walk and I started complaining and being like, damn, like, why would you make my life so difficult that you sent me to this beautiful Airbnb with stunning gardens around it and then make me feel bad for it? And obviously, like, everything I'm saying is tongue in cheek. Immediately, it makes me feel so much better when I do this. It injects a little bit of playfulness, a little bit of curiosity, a little bit of fun, almost like improv. I often will make up a bit of a song to really express my whining. I have fun with it. I don't think all emotional regulation needs to be super serious, like hand on heart, inner child work. Yes, that has its place, but sometimes you just need to be light, playful, and fun, and that can be healing too. So if you've listened to this and you're like, yes, I do want to improve my emotional regulation skills, here is the first mini move that I would take. For the next day or the next week, start to actually track your emotions and notice what your immediate internal reactions are to your emotions. If you're reacting to your difficult emotions with anything other than interest, curiosity, playfulness, or self-soothing, you probably have some work to do on your relationships with your emotions. And you'll find in doing this that it actually is in itself a form of emotional regulation. So every single time you experience an emotion, you'll probably have your initial reaction of maybe shame or guilt or whatever it may be, but then you'll follow it up with, oh, I've got to write down this emotion and I've got to get curious about what that reaction was. And I've got to document that. You'll be in this curious scientist headspace. So you're changing your reaction to your emotions, which changes your relationship with them. The last part of this podcast is always a Rex of the week, where I give you some recommendations that'll help you to dive deeper into the topics that I talked about in today's episode. So in this case, emotional regulation, starting with a book, which is called The Way Out. I'll have it linked in the show notes as well in the YouTube description. This is a book about chronic pain, but I've mentioned over and over again, it's one of the best books about emotional regulation that I personally ever read. In a way, every single difficult emotion that we feel is like a form of pain. In fact, they've shown that some difficult emotions are the equivalent to the feelings of physical pain. And this book is all about how to heal chronic pain. I actually used it to help with healing some nerve pain that I had. It worked really well, and I've also used the techniques in it to work with emotions. The second recommendation that I have is my podcast episode on how metacognitive therapy changed my life. While I don't use the words emotional regulation, that episode really is about emotional regulation. It has some of the better emotional regulation skills that I use a lot as well in that podcast episode. I'll have that linked on the screen if you're on YouTube, or in the show notes if you're not. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you soon.